Come out with us and play. Love your London. Have a banana.
Welcome to episode 2 of our series on Bayswater and Notting Hill. In today's episode of Love Your London, we'll be talking about a pub that possibly introduced new sayings into the English language. We'll be talking about where John and Yoko, Mark Bolan and others munched on vegetarian food in an underground cafe, where drag queens entertained the masses, where an ill-conceived road caused misery for thousands, where the first British punk record was conceived, where there is a cafe fit for a princess, a record shop from which Jarvis Cocker was fired, and much, much more. But we start today's journey in Kensington Gardens.
Okay, hello. Well, here we are. We're in Kensington Gardens, just off Hyde Park. And in the last episode, we spoke all about. We did quite a bit of Bayswater. In this episode, episode 2. If you haven't seen episode 1, of course, there's a little link up there in the corner where you can watch it. Episode 2, we're going to see the rest of Bayswater, and then obviously episode 3, we're going to be moving towards Portobello and Notting Hill. But there's still quite a lot of Bayswater to see, and lots of musical references, and lots of references to the swinging 60s and 70s and the whole sort of countercultural stuff. We're going to start talking about that. We'll talk about it a lot more in episodes 3 and 4, but this is, of course, Kensington Gardens. That's where the statue to Peter Pan is as well, which we spoke about because J.M. Barrie used to live just over there. So we're now going to cut through the park, go back onto Bayswater Road, and have a look at the Columbia Hotel, because the Columbia Hotel is another place where there's been, well, it's the pop stars, rock stars hotel. Everyone who's anyone has stayed there. Unfortunately, we're not staying there. Not that expensive. In fact, tonight we could stay there for £90 a night, which is not that bad, to be honest. But we can't afford it. So. You can be our patron if you want to give us some money. It'd be lovely. Don't have to give us money. You can just subscribe to our channel.
Jeez, after 4 years, you'd think he'd have given up by now. Stop the beggary.
We're going to be talking about Hyde Park in their own series under H, when we get to H in a few years' time. Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens are full of all these gates, and this gate here is Lancaster Gate. And that's what gives its name to the station, which is just down there, which we're going to talk very briefly about in a moment. But first of all, we've got over there the Columbia Hotel. Now, our American viewers might be surprised that we just thought, we're just crossing the road. There's no such thing as jaywalking over here. No law against it. It's perfectly acceptable to cross the road wherever you want. When I was in America, it took quite a mind shift to try and get used to the fact that you couldn't just cross anywhere. You can get tasered for that sort of thing. Anyway, here we are. This is the Columbia. Grand old building. This hotel is much loved by the stars of rock and roll over the years. Oasis, Amy Winehouse, Iggy Pop, Simple Minds have stayed here. Julian Cope famously took rather too much something in here. It's quite famous. He didn't really properly recover from it. Jazz Coleman of Killing Joke was banned from here for flooding his apartment and then leaving through the window without paying. Now, you see, Manhattan may have the Hotel Chelsea, but here in Bayswater we have the Columbia Hotel. What the stories of this place must tell. And 90 quid, not bad really, to stay in a room where Iggy Pop soiled the sheets.
He's not the only one to do things like that. Oh God, that's funny. Why don't you just walk through? Walk through like you're a car. I'm not brave enough.
No.
You don't want to go walk through the place where Iggy Pop soiled the sheets. What reputation have you to lose?
Yeah, we're going to show you the Swan in a minute, because that's really important. But we can't really go past this area without talking about the Royal Lancaster Hotel, which is another important landmark in the world of rock and roll. So back in episode 4 of our Battersea and Clapham Junction episodes, which was the previous series, you would have seen Sharon and myself perform a little sketch in honour of the Magical Mystery Tour.
And the Royal Lancaster Hotel, which you can see on your screen now, hosted the fancy dress themed after party for all the cast and crew involved in the 1967 Magical Mystery Tour film shortly after the hotel first opened. And it was so notorious that the hotel ended up calling their in-house nightclub the Yellow Submarine in honour of the Beatles for many years after that. But let's return to that old pub we just passed, which has a lot of history of its own.
Okay, so here we are in a grand historical pub. You see on your screen a little bit of what it's like inside. It's fortunately it's not been too gentrified like some of the pubs around here. Prices obviously quite expensive compared. I mean, they would be around here, but £6.75 a pint of Cornish Orchard cider. I mean, it's not. I've had worse. But if you remember, like back when we were just doing our episodes in Islington and we were moaning about paying £4.75 a pint in a pub overlooking the canal, and that wasn't that long ago, and now £6.75 is unfortunately quite ordinary. But let me tell you a little bit about this pub, because it's a fascinating place. It's an 18th century coaching inn. It's open every day of the week from 9 a.m. till 11 p.m. and it's been called the Swan since 1721. But there has in fact been a pub here for donkey's years, and it was originally called the Saracen's Head. So just over there to the east, there's an area of London called Tyburnia. That's what it's called now. We won't be covering it in this episode because we'll be covering it when we get to P for Paddington. Now, underneath where Marble Arch is now, there used to be a very famous gallows, the Tyburn, and that's where people would be hanged. Now, the legend has it that when people were being hanged, this would be the place where they would have their very last drink, just before. That's where we get the expression "one for the road." That's where we say we have one for the road. They would traditionally the executioner or hangman, or whoever it is who's accompanying the person who has been condemned, they would come here and they'd have their very last drink, one for the road. And there is another expression, because after he or she had one for the road, they'd be back on the wagon towards Tyburn over there, and that's where we get the expression back on the wagon. Back on the wagon meaning that you've started, you're no longer drinking. And of course, if you do then start drinking again, you've fallen off the wagon. So all those expressions have come from this pub, basically, from the legends of all the prisoners who had come here, one for the road, and then going back on the wagon. There is no 100% proof. It is a legend that has passed down from landlord to landlord, but there is no. The expressions were used when this pub was being used for the last drink. So, and there's no proof of it ever being used before then. So it's probably true. I mean, a lot often these things are true. Now there was one very famous prisoner who had one for the road right here, and that was the very notorious French highwayman Claude Duval. Now he had his one for the road here in 1670. So back then it wasn't known as the Swan, it was known as the Saracen's Head. Now he was not notorious because he was nasty, but quite the opposite. He was a gentleman. He was famous for being a gentleman. He'd never ever used violence, ever. I mean, I think the worst he ever got was he tied someone up. He tied one of his victims up on a tree and took their money. And to the ladies, he was always very, very polite, very courteous. He'd also only ever steal from the rich. He did tie a couple of victims up against the tree. I know that one of them was Squire Roper, who was the master of the Royal Buckhounds at the time. Basically, that's someone who would used to look after the dogs that the royal household would have in order to hunt for deer. He also never ever stole from men if their wives were okay to dance a courant with him. The courant or the coranto is a very stylish type of dance, and there's a really interesting painting here of Claude Duval dancing the courant with one of his victims, painted by William Powell Frith. You can see that on your screen now. Also, he was apparently extremely good looking and had a very sexy French accent, and the lady companions were only too happy to partake. He had many lady lovers over the year, and when he was finally and sadly and unfortunately hanged at the gallows at Tyburn, his body was displayed at the Tangier Tavern, as was custom, but it was then cut down and he was given a very, very honourable burial underneath St Paul's Church in Covent Garden. And this record is definitely true because it dates from 1670, the year that he was hanged. There's a memorial to Duval. I'm going to read this to you now. Here lies Duval, reader, if male thou art, look to thy purse, if female to thy heart. Much havoc has he made of both for all, men he made to stand, and women he made to fall. The second conqueror of the Norman race, knights to his arm did yield, and ladies to his face. Old Tyburn's glory, England's illustrious thief, Duval, the lady's joy, Duval, the lady's grief. I absolutely love that, and we'll obviously be talking a lot more about him when we reach series 42, when we're going to be visiting Covent Garden and Theatreland. We're expecting it to be around about second half of October 2027, if we're on schedule. We are a little bit behind schedule. COVID didn't help, and a few other things. But so do subscribe to our channel now, and that way you won't miss it when we get to it. Over here we have not really very much to say about this place. This is Lancaster Gate Station. Don't worry, this isn't going to be a big long thing about the station because it's actually quite boring. It's on the Central Line, which means it's open on weekends, on 24 hours. Obviously it's open normal time on weekdays, and it's in Zone 1. Now, it opened in the year 1900, and there's an OSI, an out-of-station interchange, between here and Paddington Station. And that means that you can, as long as you remember to touch in and touch out, both here and at Paddington or vice versa, then it counts as one journey, as long as you're quick enough. This is very, very confusing. So basically, if you travel from Lancaster Gate to Paddington National Rail, touching in and out with either your Oyster or your contactless, you're allowed a very generous 40 minutes for it to count as one journey. But if you do a reverse journey from Paddington to Lancaster Gate, you're only allowed 20 minutes, which really doesn't make much sense at all to me. However, if you want to go from Lancaster Gate to Paddington Elizabeth line, the OSI only works with an Oyster. So if you're using contactless, you will be charged for two journeys. I didn't know that was possible, but apparently it is. Also, it doesn't work at all, there's no OSI, if you're interchanging between Lancaster Gate to any other tube line of Paddington. In other words, the Bakerloo, Circle, District or Hammersmith and City. Because the system believes that it's faster to do it underground. So in that case, it's not an OSI, and you will be charged for two separate journeys. And I found that out once the hard way on New Year's Eve. It was New Year's Eve, but before it becomes free at 11:45, and I was charged two journeys. I think, why? It's meant to be an OSI, but it isn't. It's sometimes they make them really confusing, these OSIs. As I already explained in the previous episode, none of the stations around here have any toilets at all. No toilets. And also, it's not accessible. I mean, there is a lift, as you can see, but there are also steps to use as well. So it's not step free. Again, it's not a listed station, so It's really annoying that some of these stations are just so they're so inaccessible. I mean, it's just bizarre, really, why they don't try and fix these things. We're now going to walk northwest up Westbourne Terrace. A couple of interesting places to show you there. Then we're going to be talking about a friend of mine, Greg Sams, and this is kind of where the adventure begins. So actually, it's the second part of the adventure. Let me explain. We're at the moment on Westbourne Terrace, and just there is number 36. I've known Greg for 30 years, and we are going to be interviewing him in a special episode after the series, because he was a very, very important part of the whole countercultural scene that this whole area of Notting Hill and Portobello became famous for. And as we go around Bayswater and Notting Hill, we're going to be pointing out some of those touchstones, some of those landmarks that were so important in the counterculture scene that Greg and his brother and his friends were heavily involved with. But let's go back to in history. So the whole story actually starts in 1966 when Greg's brother Craig Sams was in New York, and he went to The Paradox, which was a macrobiotic restaurant in New York, where Yoko Ono was working, and he fell in love with macrobiotic food and decided that when he would return to London, he was going to perhaps set something up with his brother Greg. Their mother, Margaret, was living in London at the time. And Greg was recovering in Stoke Mandeville Hospital after breaking his back when he fell out of a tree at Berkeley University. So Craig graduated, and he spent the next year or so setting up Seed with Greg Sams, his brother. Now, the original Seed was at number 10A Airlie Gardens, which you can see now on your screen. It opened in 1967. So it's just off Campden Hill Road, not far from Notting Hill Gate, but technically not within the Notting Hill area. So we will be returning there properly when we do our Kensington episodes. So it was in the basement of a residential building, as you can see, and the people living there weren't happy at all. They complained to the council, and it got shut down after just 3 months. So this is when they moved here to this legal venue. And this, I mean, now as you can see, number 36, you can see all the buttons there on the right hand side. It's now flats. Used to be a hotel, used to be the George, and it was in the basement of the George, basically. I imagine it was down there. I'm not sure which of these would be.
This looks more interesting, but
I'm not sure, actually. I'm sure that
dirty maxi pad, nice.
Okay, I'm sure that Greg will be able to let me know whether it was the basement. It was 36.
That's not very macrobiotic.
It was 36A. I'm not sure whether A was that side or that side. I'll let you know. This was a hotel, the George. Seed version 2 opened up legally in its basement, and it was buzzing every single night with rock stars and artists desperate to eat natural organic foods that they couldn't find anywhere else. Mark Bolan was a regular, and it was here where we met Mickey Finn, and they then went on to set up T-Rex. Now, you may remember we visited Mark Bolan's shrine in the very first episode on Barnes, and there is a link in the description.
Let's get out of here before they call the security.
Now, John Lennon and Yoko Ono were often in here eating all the fantastic food. Because after all, it was in the Paradox where Yoko Ono was working in New York and where Craig got to meet her. John would often come here straight from the studio to listen to tapes from sessions that he'd just finished recording, because they had a really good sound system here, and you could hear it from miles around. It's quite funny because it actually caught the attention of the coppers. The police couldn't work out why all the they couldn't work out why all these long-haired hippies were coming in here late at night and all the music or whatever. So they got raided, and when the police turned up, all they found was a load of hippies sitting on couches and eating vegetarian organic food.
Mung beans, Tristán, mung beans.
Yeah, which completely befuddled them. They didn't know what the hell was going on, and I'm sure that Greg will be able to fill us in a little bit later when we speak to him. Anyway, so it was around about then that Greg started a magazine called Harmony, and it was a magazine that was all about macrobiotic food and much more. And John Lennon even helped to promote it by publishing inside it a special cartoon that he drew. And I'm going to read this out to you. You can see it on your screen. So I was a vegetarian, so I was slow. So I read this book. So I went to Greg's. So I did 10 days rice, so I was fast. So I read this, Harmony. Hi, Greg. There we go. So we all need harmony. That was drawn by John Lennon on November the 7th, 1968. So Harmony lasted for 3 issues after it was turned into a new magazine called Seed, which was, and the editor of Seed was Sam's brother's dad, Ken, who was a former Air Force employee at Vietnam, who had already set up the most famous countercultural magazine about, or rather against, the Vietnam War in America, called Grunt. Seed magazine was published monthly from November 1971 until March 1977, so quite a lot of episodes. But we are getting ahead of ourselves a bit because, as I said, we're going to be talking a lot more about those days when we have our chat with Greg Sands, and we're also going to be talking about it when we visit places such as where Harmony Foods was based, and also a few other important landmarks in Greg Sam's and Craig Sam's and Ken Sam's history. So we're now going to move on a little bit up towards Porchester Square. There we go, we've landed from our little trip in Google Earth, our little blimp. We've obviously, you might think, well, hang on, that's quite a long distance, but we actually covered that in the last episode. So we've kind of gone in a bit of a circle. We're now going to do the northern part of Bayswater, but this particular bit here, this is Porchester Square, and this was the very last part of the whole development to be finished. The houses around the beautiful and majestic Porchester Square. And this here is Porchester Hall. Very, very famous hall. It used to be a huge LGBTQ plus nightlife place, especially for the tea part of that. There used to be a lot of drag nights. It was probably one of the biggest nights, I would have thought, in drag and in London, and it was a huge fun. In the late 1960s until the early 1980s, they would hold the infamous monthly Porchester Hall Drag Ball. Now there's another very famous claim to fame that this place has, because it is here where, if you're fans of Monty Python, where in The Meaning of Life, the famous sketch with Mr. Creosote wanted his would you like a wafer thin, is it wafer? Is it wafer? Would you like a wafer thin mincer? And it was like, and then they had that horrible scene where everything just burst out. And everyone started, retching. It was a fantastic scene. It was filmed here in Porchester Hall. This is just another one of those little fascinating anecdotes that we've uncovered through our meticulous research. Here we have Porchester Spa. This is it's a very pretty Victorian-style sauna, steam room, bath and spa. I suppose it's not, when I say it's Victorian, it's not strictly Victorian, because it was completed in 1929, I think 1929. Not kind of our kind of place. I mean, this is when I say it's Victorian in style, obviously actually also Victorian in morality as well, because I think the male only you don't have to wear a swimsuit, and maybe the female only either. But there are absolutely nothing here. No mixed sessions here. There really aren't enough naturist places in London. I mean, if you there were in the link in the description, you'll see that we went to one in Alexandra Palace. We went to a sauna that was naturist. But other than that, apart from the odd swim in Malden Street, there's very, very little, especially for mixed for mixed sessions. All they needed to do is maybe just have one session a week that would cater for the naturist community, but it's also a matter of health as well, because wearing swimsuits it's just ludicrous. I mean, we must be the only country in Northern Europe that has this ludicrous idea that you should wear a swimsuit in a sauna. It's actually, I mean, you'd be thrown out of a sauna in Finland or Germany if you deign to do such a thing. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. There's nothing. I mean, it's a beautiful building, but if you can't be naked, what's beautiful about it? Almost forgot about that place over there, Madame. That is where cherry jam used to be. And it was Ben Watts from Everything But the Girl. Started, hang on, this is a bit of a, here we go. Yeah, so Cherry Jam used to be Cherry Jam, started in 2002 by Ben Watts from Everything But the Girl. He started a nightclub here, and shortly after opening, the Libertines played their very first ever official gig here. And this is also where Adele was discovered when she did a gig here, aged 17 in 2005. So it's now Madame.
No, I don't think so. It's been, have a look at that notice.
Taken possession, any attempt of re-entry of the said property is an offence, and proceedings will be taken for trespass and criminal damage. Well, actually, that's really interesting it says that, because this whole area is extremely famous for its squatting culture. And we're going to be talking quite a lot about that in episode 4 of this series. It's a really, really interesting story. So if you don't know it, you won't actually believe the things that actually happened here. But I really can't wait to tell you that. But I don't want to. No spoilers. I want you to tell you. But it's quite interesting that's been because that would be right for a bit of squatting, wouldn't it? Anyway, let's now just have a little talk. Because over here you can see all this bridge, and that's because we are near the Royal Oak Station. I'm going to very, very, very quickly tell you about Royal Oak Station. We already told you in the previous episode that the Porchester, which is the pub just down there, used to be known as the Royal Oak. It changed its name in 2008, which I think is a real shame, because it's one of those few tube stations that are named after pubs, like the Elephant and Castle and the Angel. Now, there is no real special connection with the Royal Oak and this area, apart from the pub. Now, for those who don't know, because there's a lot of pubs in the UK called the Royal Oak, and that actually refers to an oak tree, a very old oak tree, in Boscobel Wood, where Charles II hid from the Roundheads. Now, he actually confided to Samuel Pepys that he was hiding in the tree, and the parliamentarians passed right beneath him. Now, that tree doesn't exist anymore. Branches were torn off it over the following 2 centuries by royalist souvenir hunters. But there is still the so-called son of Royal Oak growing in location in Shropshire, and you can buy saplings from its acorns in an attempt to prevent further vandalism, because if you can buy the acorns, then you don't tear branches off. So as a result, the Royal Oak is a very popular pub name. It's the 3rd most popular in Britain. But it is a shame that the one tube station that was named after the Royal Oak, sorry about this terrible noise, but it's the ambulance, they're allowed to make noise, as are we. So it's a popular pub name. as I said, though, it's a shame that the pub is no longer called the Royal Oak, because it's the only pub called the Royal Oak that is named a tube station. And here it is. There's not really very much to say about this at all, I'm afraid. Apart from the fact it's on this very loud and noisy bridge. It's on the Hammersmith and City lines and on the Circle line. It's in Zone 2 and it opened in 1871. As I've said about all the stations in this area, there's no toilets and there's no lift, there's no step-free access. It's completely not inaccessible to anyone with wheelchairs or stuff like that. All these people had to carry their cases up loads of stairs. It's very, very inconvenient. Look at them with their suitcases and stuff. As you can see, there's the stairs down there. It's not listed. However, there is a little silver lining. It is scheduled to become accessible soon. We don't really know when exactly. It's actually through serendipity that it's going to become accessible, because there were plans to open a new coach station here as an alternative to Victoria Coach Station, but the locals fiercely opposed it. So Mayor Sadiq Khan has since then promised that the land that had been initially earmarked for the new coach station will now be used for affordable housing and to make Royal Oak Station accessible. So it is a potential, yay, but not yet. So still quite a lot of work to be done. Right, so look at this thing here. Look at this ugly thing. It's called the Westway.
Yeah,
this flyover.
I'm going to take a standard.
Now, we're going to be talking a lot about the Westway in the next couple of episodes. But since we're here, we'll have to tell you a little bit about it now. So we're going to be talking about this quite a lot in the next 3 episodes, because it had a huge impact on the local population and it was almost entirely negative. It was originally conceived in 1943, but it was not until the early 1960s when things really began to take shape and people began to realise the impact that it would have on their lives. So in 1962, the compulsory purchases started, and it was estimated that about 3,356 families would end up having to be rehoused or relocated. This was way out as it happened. In fact, almost 5,000 entire families lost their homes for every single mile of the Westway, not in total. They thought it was 3,356 in total. In the end, every mile, 5,000 homes, 5,000 families lost their homes. And the other thing is, all the people whose houses weren't pulled down in order to make this, they lived right next to this motorway, and they were absolutely fuming because they had no compensation at all for the disruption, for the noise that was right on their doorstep. There were lots and lots of protests. But what the Westway did was it kick-started a real counterculture here in this area of London, one that continues very much to this day, as you can see here from this wonderful graffiti. And that's why we're coming back to the Westway in the next episode, when we're going to be talking about the protests at Acklam Road, and again in episode 4 of this series, when I'm going to be telling you all about the attempt to set up the independent state of Tristonia, which is a fascinating story. And each time we return to this story, we're going to tell you a little bit more about what an awful project this was and how it went way over budget. We're also going to be talking about the involvement of Michael Heseltine, and even the young Prince Charles turned up here to try and give it some good PR. It failed. So do remember to hit that notification bell because then you'll get a notification and you won't miss it. Because if you're interested in this whole project, this terrible project, this thing that should never ever have happened, then you're just going to learn so much if you don't know it already. But I'm sure even if you think you know it already, I'm going to be unveiling some stuff that you knew absolutely nothing about. So you don't want to miss it. But now, let's head off towards Alexander Street. Here we are. number 32 Alexander Street. I did promise you there's going to be a lot of music history in these episodes, and this is such an important place in the history of music, and especially of punk, but in music in general. It was in that basement, just down here, where music history happened. So on your screen you'll see a press release that was put into the very first release in 1976 by Stiff Records, who call themselves the world's most flexible record label. And as you'll see in the top right circle where that green blob just flashed, the address is 32 Alexander Street, which is here. This first release was Nick Lowe's track So It Goes, with Heart of the City on the B-side, which they proudly announced uses only just 3 chords. So if you ever do come across this single and it still has this press release in it, it's definitely worth 3 figures, maybe even 4. Without it, 30 tops. 10,000 copies were sold, so it's not exactly rare, but most of them don't have the press release still in them, with that iconic design by Barney Bubbles. You see the little bubble writing at the top. He's so famous for his designs. So legend has it the studio was set up thanks to a £400 loan from Lee Brilliot of Dr. Feelgood. At least that's what it says on Wikipedia. However, I've done my research, and the guys behind Stiff Records say that they never cashed a cheque, and that it was on their wall as an emergency fund and as a reminder of their humble beginnings. So their Stiff Records' next release was Between the Lines by Pink Fairies. They were proto-punk. When I say proto-punk, I mean that they sort of like came in that, they weren't punk, but they came in that sort of like that quite, that very early time before punk. And it has some similarities with punk. Pink Fairies were a local band from Ladbroke Hill, though their drummer Twink was originally from Colchester in Essex. Well, I say was, he's actually still going strong today. Aged 80, he now goes by the name Muhammad Abdullah, having converted to Islam in 2006, and he is still releasing banging psychedelic music, including some music that he made with our mate Sterling Roswell from Spacemen 3, or Mary Stewart as she's now known. You met her in our lockdown special, and there's a link in the description. But it was a single that Stiff Records released later that year that changed the UK music scene forever. It was Stiff's 6th release, New Rose by The Damned. So now this is regarded as the very first ever British punk song proper. Not the first in the world, because punk came from Peru, of course. Ah, you may be saying, Peru? What do you mean? No, the Ramones and all that sort of stuff. No. Punk originated in Peru. I'm going to leave a little link in the description, but a song called Demolición by Los Psychos. Predates all that punk stuff, and you couldn't get anything more punk than that. Love that song. Anyway, back to The Damned's New Rose. If you have an original copy of that lying around and not a reissue, you're talking about £500 minimum, even more if it's mint. Though, of course, it won't be mint because it once belonged to a punk fan. Anyhow, Stiff Records went on to record and produce some of the best and most loved albums of my generation, including In Jury and the Blockheads, Hit Me with your rhythm stick, hit me, das ist gut, c'est fantastique. Absolutely classic there. That was recorded here, and it was amazing. Well, that was released here. Another famous record, because they didn't just do punk, Elvis Costello. His album My Aim Is True. And this was one of the first times that a record company really thought seriously about the collector. Every 5,000th album pressed would have a different colour. So what this did is this just added to its collectability, because there are some people who are serious collectors who obviously wanted to have every single... it's a bit cynical, I guess, but I mean, they all do it. I mean, ABBA did it recently with their new Voyage album. It had loads of different colours coming out. But this was the very first time that someone actually thought, hang on, let's just have every sort of like few thousand releases, let's just bring it out in a different colour vinyl. They were the first. They were groundbreaking in that respect. And of course, you might think that that ripping off fans isn't very punk, but au contraire, why not rip off those who are only buying records as an investment, because the real fans will just buy the one to enjoy as a piece of music. Madness, all their seminal albums such as One Stop Beyond and The Rise and Fall, all made by Stiff. The Pogues, King Kurt. Remember, we spoke quite a lot about King Kurt in our Battersea to Clapham Junction episodes. Destination Zululand, that was recorded here as well, as was a lot of King Kurt's stuff. A Motorhead. A lot of people don't realise this, but it was actually Stiff Records that gave Motorhead their first big break when they were completely unknown, recording 3 tracks with them in 1976, White Line Fever, Leaving Here and Intro, because they really like taking punts on unknown acts. I mean, I could go on. Everyone, basically. And Stiff Records still exists to this day. They're still independent, though they are slightly less punk, being connected now to Universal. And of course they're no longer operating from a basement here on a residential street on Alexander Street in Bayswater. That house over there, number 169 Westbourne Grove, is where Damon Albarn, the singer of Blur,
that's a name I recognise,
and Gorillaz, of course, it's a band, obviously, but it's a sort of like not real people in it, if you know what I mean. That's where he lives, and he still lives there now. Everyone knows he lives there. You only have to go on Company's House. You can see you type in Damon Albarn or type in Gorillaz, you'll see that is a listed address, and everyone knows him. Everyone sees them all the time. Where would Damon Albarn go if he wanted to have a quick drink? He'd come here probably to the Walmer Castle. Until very, very recently, it was run by David Beckham and Guy Ritchie. They did it up, but to their credit, they did it up fairly tastefully. It does still look like a pub inside. Of course, Guy Ritchie got quite a few pubs. He no longer has this one. He started off with the Punch Bowl when he was with Madonna. Since then, he's bought the Law of the Land in Fitzrovia. This was a short venture that he had with Sir David Beckham, I should say. He's a Sir now, of course. And they owned it between 2018 and 2022. They apparently used to come here quite often. It is a little bit expensive though. The cheapest beer here, which is a low alcohol 4% lager, is £6.80 a pint, and almost all of them are £7, £8, £9 even. Fish and chips, £21.50. I don't think I'd eat that, even if David Beckham himself served it to me. So it's a little bit. We don't have very much money. So if you want to support us, we've got a Patreon account, and it's thanks to our Patreon accounts and our patrons that we've managed to get these fantastic microphones. I'm sure that you must agree that the sound is an awful lot better than it normally is. But if you don't want to support us financially, you can support us via other means, such as subscribing to our channel and sharing these episodes. You know, your little buttons on your screen, you know what to do. Like us, comment in the YouTube comments. Anyway, that's enough celebrity haunting at the moment. Let's see where we're going next. Now, we're going to be talking quite a lot about music in the next, certainly in the next episode, and especially in episode 4, where we talk about Notting Hill Carnival. We could have shown you loads of places along the way, just isn't time really. We could have shown you the location where Sting first bumped into Trudy Styler, in spite of living on Leinster Square with his wife and child. But this is much more important, because this is the DoubleTree by Hilton. Until recently, it was the Embassy Hotel, and I'm sure you've heard of the band Manic Street Preachers. This was the very last place that the singer of the Manic Street Preachers was seen, on the 31st of January 1995. He had been staying the night with James Dean Bradfield, and they were meant to be flying off that morning to the US to promote their third album, The Holy Bible. That morning he left all his luggage behind, including his medication. I think he was on Prozac, and he checked out of room 516 with his passport and was never ever seen again. And it's one of the greatest mysteries in British musical culture. It's very, very sad as well, because the band, I mean, they had absolutely no idea about it. None of them have ever heard anything of him. I mean, they were absolutely distraught. I mean, if you go, and I saw them at Glastonbury in 2007, and there was a microphone in the middle there, just in case he turns up, because that's the thing they do. They always hope that maybe one day he'll appear as mysteriously as he disappeared, and in the middle of one of their gigs he'll get up and take the microphone. So the invitation is always there, open for him. And also the band have always made sure that any royalties get put in escrow into a special account just for whenever the singer decides to reappear. Now, it isn't really my kind of music. I only happened to see them because my feet had literally stuck in the clay after watching Dame Shirley Bassey at the Pyramid Stage in the Sunday afternoon slot, and I couldn't move. And I kind of wanted to stay in the area to see The Who are headlining that night, but they really impressed me. But the tragedy started here in this hotel in room 516. I assume that the room is probably still booked out now by fans of the band. I don't know why they necessarily would. It's a bit morbid if he is no longer with us. I think he's he's not. I mean, the band still really hope that he's alive, but who knows? We couldn't really come to this area, could we, without talking about the very famous and very fun Café Diana. Now, some of you may think that this is a little bit cynical. This is a Diana-themed cafe run by Iraqi cafe owner Abdul Basit. And you may think it's some kind of tourist cash grab that he set up following the princess's death. Because after all, the Diana Memorial Garden is just over there in Hyde Park. We're going to visit that, of course, when we get to H. However, there's no cynicism or anything. As you can see, it's been here since 1989. So you look at the decal up there, and the owner had always been a massive Princess Diana fan. I mean, he was going to open a cafe here anyway. He hadn't thought of a name, and he happened to see Princess Di with her two sons walking past. Now, obviously, Kensington Palace is literally just around the corner, so he called it Café Diana, not thinking in his wildest dreams that she would ever visit. But she visited, and often. She absolutely loved it here, would often come in for breakfast, and on her third visit, she brought an autographed portrait for him to hang on the wall. So right now, this cafe is a paean to the People's Princess. Her royal likeness hangs everywhere, as you'll see now, and obviously since her death the custom has only increased. But it's important to note that this was the Diana Cafe during her lifetime. We're at the junction of Clanricarde Gardens and, of course, Bayswater Road. This whole area is still known to this day as the Gravel Pits Estate. That is because the area was for a good 200 plus years, from the 1600s through to the early 1800s, known for its rich gravel, which was a very important resource for house building. Many of them, of course, ended up in the possession of Edward Orme, whom we mentioned in detail in the last episode, and who left such a mark on the buildings and town planning here. Notting Hill and Bayswater were kind of built up around this whole region. There's some really good pictures you can see on your screen of the gravel pits and what they looked like, and as I said, this whole area is still called the Gravel Pits Estate. And yeah, so it was just here. There were like trenches and all the way down here there was a beautiful rich gravel. Here we are, the world famous Music and Video Exchange. This is a great record shop for second-hand records. Now, we are going to be doing a special later on this year in which we're going to be talking about the 20, maybe the 30, I don't know, but they're the 20 best record shops for second-hand vinyl in London. This may well end up being on there somewhere. I'm not going to say exactly where. I don't actually know where yet, but because I haven't actually done the list. But We're going to be visiting them all. We'll be visiting this one, of course, because it is so famous, and you do get some really good bargains downstairs, especially cassettes and 78s and stuff like that. But why else is this famous? Well, it opened in 1967, which is a long time ago for shops which move and change all the time. 1967. And now obviously, long before video came to kill the radio star, it was then called the Record and Tape Exchange. Now it's called the Music and Video Exchange. They specialise in buying your vinyl collection, and they're seriously into jazz and classical. In fact, the whole basement is dedicated to classical music, I believe. But they have moved with the times, and they also have a dedicated electronica section as well. Now, someone who used to work here, very famous, was Jarvis Cocker from Pulp. Now, this won't be news to hardcore Pulp fans, but the band formed in 1978, and by 1994 they still hadn't really cracked the scene. Well, they were just cracking the scene. Jarvis at that time in 1994 was working here, obviously listening to loads and loads of music and getting inspiration, and also getting mightily frustrated because earlier that year Jarvis had got so frustrated at how such an anodyne song such as Wet Wet Wet's Love Is All Around had spent so long in the charts that there was actually a bit of a spat between the two bands at the time. All that time he was working here, and he was also a customer here, swapping some of his own records for a second-hand Casio keyboard which he used to write the chorus melody for his 1995 mega hit Common People. Jarvis actually lost his job here in 1994, maybe 1995, I think it was possibly just early 1995, for turning up to work very late after having a bit of a psychedelic session, shall we say, and so he lost his job, but I think that was the least of his worries, because a few months later he'd be earning megabucks, and good luck to him. So yeah, so I mean, look at this. This is Shirley Bassey, for all we know, and what's done is done. 10p, down from 50p. Talk. Now, Talk is that's the first disc. It's not this one. I actually had the one I got was Talk by Talk, but that was the very first record I bought on mail order in Spain. Psych Garage Revival, which is my favourite.
How's it run for?
Knee-jerk reactions. This is Italian. The Headstones and Hunchback Men. Yep. Might have to get that one. Dementia 13. I have no idea who this is. The Sound Asleep. But for £1, bit of Garage Revival, I think it would be rude not to. So that is definite. And let's have a quick look in the Mod Revival as well. There we go. That's one of the. This is one of the Stiff records. We were talking about Stiff records earlier. Madness, All in the Mind. Most of Madness is of course. There's House of Fun. £14. Baggy Trousers, £1. Absolutely, I've got it, but I haven't got it as a. Let's have a look. Oh no! Why have I come in here? Oh, the Lambrettas. Look at that. A bit of Eurovision history. Bardo. One step further. I'm going to have to get that. 10p. Sorry, Bardo. Don't deserve to be 10p. there you go, we've covered all of Bayswater. The next 2 episodes are all going to be about the Notting Hill area, which you'll see on your map now. So episode 3 is going to be about the eastern half, and also talk about Portobello Market. And then episode 4 is going to be all about the western half, talking about Notting Hill Carnival, of course, also talking about Notting Hill, talking about Frestonia, talking about Grenfell, very, very sad. And we're going to be we're going to be doing a lot more sort of the stuff. This was quite a short episode for us. Our next episode, episode 3, is going to be mega. It's going to be, well over an hour anyway. There's so much work has gone involved, so please subscribe and everything. And well, I think that just leaves us to say, till next time, bye! Yay!
We suck so bad.
Next time on Love Your London, we head up Portobello Road, talking about the history of the market, the many people who lived there and drank there, and we'll be talking about the cinema, some of the music establishments, as well as the area's contribution to counterculture, from Mangrove to the Ceres Grain Store, from strange attractions to alchemy. We're going to have to talk about that movie, even though we'd rather not have to, but it would be remiss of us to leave it out. And much, much more. Till next time.
From Acton Town to Wimbledon, from Brixton to beyond, love your London, have a banana.